Hello, and welcome to Vision New England's Church in Action podcast. Here we talk with New England leaders about critical issues that impact how Christians engage in our culture to accelerate evangelism.
Hi, I'm Charles Galda. I'm the president of Vision New England. Welcome to our Church in Action podcast. We talk about issues of God and culture here. We know that when we're living like Jesus, we'll be known for our love, our unity, our love for the world as well as for each other. We'll exemplify unity, in fact, and we'll be known for good works and addressing the problems of society. And when we do those things, we know that opens doors to sharing Jesus, but you don't have to take my word for it. Jesus tells us that in John 17:21, Matthew 5:16. So we talk about our issues, the challenges that face our society, our cultural context, making disciples, doing justice, loving Jesus, sharing Jesus. And this is another day where we're going to tackle one aspect of that. We have a special guest with us. He's actually the guest from our inaugural podcast back in September. So he didn't learn his lesson. He was willing to come back. Dr. Emmett G. Price III is a professor at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, professor of worship, church, and culture there. He's the executive director of the Institute for the Study of the Black Church Experience there. But he's also the founding pastor of Community of Love Christian Fellowship in Boston. He's a contributor to WGBH Public Radio, and he has his own podcast. He's the executive producer of it and the co-host of All Revved Up. Emmett, thanks for being back with us again today.
Hey, my dear brother Charles, so wonderful to be with you, and thanks for the invitation.
Thanks. Now, I should start for our audience. I should start by saying these are not scripted conversations. Emmett and we've agreed on the topics, but we haven't walked through it, and there's not a script. It's just meant to be an informal conversation between brothers. And so I don't know what Emmett's going to say. He doesn't know everything I'm going to ask. Odds are we'll disagree on something. I hope we will. Otherwise, it'll just be a conversation of me telling Emmett he's brilliant and him telling me I'm perceptive.
How boring would that be?
Right. I like to hear I'm perceptive, but I don't think anybody else wants to hear it. And so we think the disagreement is valuable, or the probing, but we think doing it in love and Christian love and respect is an important thing for us to model for the world, because that's missing. And in fairness, it's missing in the church sometimes. But Proverbs talks about iron sharpening iron, the concept of let's challenge each other. We get to truth by challenging each other. And hopefully we understand each other, but it's not intended to be a debate. It's to exchange views. And so we've talked in our podcast, a number of episodes about race and racial reconciliation. A lot of us have been doing more reading and self-education on it. But it has struck me over that time that the language of race is evolving. And sometimes it's used inconsistently. Sometimes people mean something different but when they use it. And sometimes I think that may be creating barriers to reconciliation as opposed to facilitating reconciliation. So we wanted to talk about that. Now, some folks will listen and we'll get a little bit wordy. That's a preacher's thing to do, and I'm wired that way anyway. But I don't mean wordy meaning too many words. I mean wordy on, hey, you're spending too much getting hung up on terminology. But our point this morning is to get a little hung up on terminology. And because if we can't agree on the meaning of words, it's really going to be hard to make progress. And so, but Emmett, before we get into that, let me throw you a little bit of a curveball. It wasn't the topic we agreed to talk about, but somebody did post on our Facebook page about this podcast. So it's before we've aired it. They said, you keep making it worse by all this hypothetical nonsense. Now, we took that down because I would hate for an unbeliever to think that's how Christians think we ought to be talking to each other. It doesn't reflect the love of Jesus. But do me a favor, respond to this sentiment. Should we even discuss race? Do we make it worse by talking about it?
You know, I think that's a wonderful, honest, transparent, vulnerable expression by this individual who wrote this. And perhaps in their personal life, they may be overwhelmed and exhausted. And I know many folks, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of station in life, regardless of their own spiritual formation and praxis, are tired and exhausted with a host of things, including being bombarded by conversations that they're not necessarily invited into. And so I think a good conversation is one that has an on-ramp, one where any and everyone can find themselves at the table. sitting there, whether they want to participate in the conversation or not. And so I think it's an honest expression. I think the flip side of the expression is that there are many of us, and I'll include myself in this category, who have been waiting a long time to be a part of the healing. And unfortunately, sometimes the way that healing happens in particularly, shall I say, white evangelical spaces is codified in this old adage that comes from the continent of Africa. And it says this: what you do for us, without us, you do to us. And so this notion of people making decisions about whether to talk about it or whether not to talk about it, what healing looks like, what healing doesn't look like, what reconciliation looks like, what reconciliation doesn't look like, without the people who are deeply and perhaps negatively impacted by the decisions at the table. So I think that it's fair to say that people are exhausted and people are tired. But I think it's also fair to say that there are many of us who have been waiting for generations, Charles, to have this kind of conversation with you and with Vision New England, to be able to say, hey, I have something to say. You may disagree with me, but perhaps let's just, air it out. And again, thank you for the opportunity to take this space and at least be heard, be seen, and be experienced.
Thanks. That's all great points. I appreciate that. And we do sometimes in the church and in the world, right? So it's not just a comedy. We do know what we need to accomplish and what we need to do before we hear from anybody that it involves, right? And so let's start with terminology. Let's start, I think, at the basic one. And so Merriam-Webster defines racism as a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Are you okay with that definition?
I think I am. I mean, I think the end of it, where we get to superiority, gives us the entree to a sense of inquiry in terms of who wrote the definition, right? So I'm going to suggest that quote unquote Black people didn't write the definition. I'm going to suggest that quote unquote Asian people didn't write that definition. I'm going to suggest that indigenous people didn't write that definition. So where does that lead us to? That definition comes out of a sense of colonialism by which race was defined, where white was the basis and everybody else was codified or phenotyped as a response to not being white. And so that's where the superiority piece comes in. And the beginning of that definition, often talking about the phenotyping, when you go back to a person's nation, they don't offer a designation based on race. They call themselves Australian if you're from Australia. You call yourself Korean if you're from Korea. You're Nigerian if you're from Nigeria. You're not Black, Asian, white, etc. So I'm okay with that definition, as long as we can interrogate the context around from which it comes.
And so now what I hear you saying is that that's a white perspective on comparing ourselves to others. But I think race is not a uniquely American or uniquely white and Black thing, is it? If you go to Japan, right, that those Koreans, right? If you go to England, those Germans, if you go to, is that different?
Yeah, because Koreans are not a race. You see what I mean? Germans are not a race. That's a nationality. You see what I mean? So the conflation of nationalities and then also ethnicities, right? Because within Korea, there are a number of other people groups. There's indigenous populations that, within Germany, there's a number of people groups, within. So the notion really only in America, if I can say this, in the United States of America, do we not call each other Americans? We call each other Black, white, Asian American, Hispanic American, Latinx American, et cetera, et cetera. So part of the colonialist experiment, which happens here in the United States primarily, and is global, there's a conflation of terminology where oftentimes when we're talking about race, we're not sure what we're talking about, right? There's no race in the Bible. There's the human race, and then there's ethnicities, right? Peoples, nations, and tongues. So the conflation of race is a category which was created after all of these things already existed for a purpose.
So if it's a colonial, because I hear you saying two things. I hear you saying it's a colonial invention, which was not uniquely American.
That's
I
correct.
hear you. It also sounds like you're saying it's a little bit uniquely American. Can you
Well,
clarify that a little bit?
yeah. So when we get to the notion of the MAFA, right, the transatlantic slave trade, you had British, you had Portuguese, you had French, you had German, you had a whole number of people who were human trafficking under the banner of the cross. And so when they get here to the United States, in order to continue to create a sense of superiority, those folks had to, conglomerate. They had to become a thing. And what they became was white. They were no longer calling themselves German. They were no longer calling themselves French. They were no longer calling themselves British, right? They became white. And that sense of whiteness was a veil to others. The Irish came much later, but have been included in whiteness. Ironically, Jewish folks who were for many years not seen as white have been able to become white in certain situations, in certain stands. So the gates of whiteness swing both ways in many ways, which is not how ethnicity works. It's certainly not how nationality works. So it's a conflated notion that was created.
I have a high confidence level we're going to get sidetracked in some of these conversations and we won't make it through. But so let me, right, I do remember reading things where when the Irish first came, call it the white race, I'm not sure they were not considered us, right?
That's
now
correct.
I'm part Irish, right? It was a separate race. It was a distinct race. Southern Europeans were a distinct race.
That's correct.
And so now that's gone over time. And so that sounds, so help me with that. Hey, white race is one thing, but actually those are different races, but suddenly now but eventually they're not.
So now we're getting into the concept of whiteness, right? Which again becomes the baseline of the American experiment, right? The American experiment gave citizenship to land owning white males. Okay. So it didn't say only those who were from Germany and France and not those from British. It said to land owning white males, to distinguish them from women, and certainly to distinguish them from indigenous people, and certainly to distinguish them from Africans and the progeny of Africans, by whatever terminology we call, my population of people. So the point is that in the construction of the American experiment, race becomes a definer of citizenry. And so that, I mean, we can't separate that, right? So it's a conflation of terminologies, but in the American experiment, race is embedded within our guiding document.
And now I think, though, it evolved over time because there were landowning African Americans early on, and there were elected officials. They're the earliest elected official who's African American in this country, is actually from the town I live in. I learned of him. And so there were times where African Americans could vote in some states, where they could serve in government, where they could own property, but it seems like that moved around over time. Is that fair?
It's fair because you're talking about Reconstruction and a number of things. So the defining point and where you get to the supremacy idea was who were the people who moved it? Who were the people who decided when Black people had rights and when they didn't? It certainly was not Black people. So it was people who felt that they were superior to the Black folks and robbed us of our agency to be able to be full participants in the experiment of America.
And so let me go back to the point you were making about the imperialist slave trade and what came out, because there was also an Arab slave trade. There was in Asia, there were slave trades between countries as well into the 20th century even. But your point is the Arab, I'll call it Arab African, that slave trade was not a racial thing?
Well, I mean, we can certainly call that what it is. I'm just trying to bring the narrative to where we are here in the United States. I mean, we can, people have been human trafficking, since the Old Testament of the Bible, which I think is absolutely horrible and needs to stop. So let me put a PSA right there. There was, intra-Africa continent human trafficking amongst people who were fighting against one another, right? But those are ethnicities, you're right. So it's not white versus black. And again,
tribal or
yeah,
country or
yeah,
okay.
different people groups, absolutely.
Okay. And I think that's an important point is we think we ended slavery in 1860. Some would say, well, no, actually, we just changed the form of it here.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless of how you think of that conversation, there's a ton of slavery in the world today, maybe
Absolutely.
more than there ever was,
yeah.
Including here in the US. And we've done some podcasts on human trafficking as well. And it's pretty prevalent.
Yeah.
And so I think we've got a definition that racism is a belief in superiority by one group of people versus another. And in this country, it was white versus. So can there be then black racists?
I mean, it depends on how you play the power dynamic, right? So many people would suggest that racism implies a certain sense of power and authority by which a group can subjugate another group, right? And so in this nation, I mean, there was a term back in the 80s and the 90s called reverse racism. Remember that? And,
I'm much too young. I don't know the term.
I say, I don't know how you reverse racism, right? Because racism is just racism. So I think people have an awareness. I don't necessarily see, at least in the United States, a notion of black racism. I think that there are black white racists. If you want to get, conflate terms, that there are black people who are operating against other black people, having been, how should we say, indoctrinated and acculturated within the white supremacist ideology, who are at play in not in the best interest of black people. And I think people who tend to operate in that space become exemplars for white people to suggest, well, if this person, can believe this, how come the rest of yous, can't believe that, right? So we still do that, try to find exemplars to make a case of monolithic and homogeneous, homogeneity within a people group, which I think is wrong too. So I personally don't see black racism, but somebody could make the case for it.
Well, let me ask, because the definition doesn't speak to that power dynamic you were just talking about.
Well, superiority is about power. And that's the piece. Yeah.
Okay. And so but let me ask this and see if it connects or not then. So when I read Du Bois or Booker T. Washington, it's not a prominent theme, but there does seem to be a theme of, and I would understand it, right, of freedmen coming out of slavery saying, I'll put words in their mouth because they don't say it this way. We're better than them because we're not like them. That's what white people are. Is there an aspect of racism to that? Or even go to the 60s I'm not like the Black Panther movement, and that, right, what this is, white people are evil, we can never get along, right? So we're going to do, is that a racism thing or is that something different?
Yeah, I don't read it that way. I mean, the way I read, let's say Du Bois, 1903, The Souls of Black Folk, one of the greatest books ever published in the land, where he prophetically declared that the problem of the 20th century would be the color line. Right. I mean, this is 1903 and we're in 2021. And the problem of the 20th and the 21st century is still the color line. In essence, the color of one's skin, in essence, racism. Right. So I think and Du Bois would also talk about the veil and talk about, the sense of double consciousness, which means that I have to learn how to embody my own experience as a black man, but I have to also learn how to live in a white world. And so I don't hear him saying that we're better than, white folks. I hear him saying that I wish that we didn't have to prove ourselves and get validated by white folks in order to be men and human beings.
Sorry, just to clarify, I wasn't reading as they were saying that, but as they were writing about what some of the experiences were coming out of slavery, that there was a little bit of a subtle notion of that. And I would understand it if I were a slave being freed. I think those people were awful and right and they're not human.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that they even had the space to deal with better or less than, because the energy was about survival, and the energy was about the survival of their progeny, right? So we get to the place of trying to protect our children from this illness of racism. So I don't really have time to be focused on, am I better than you? Actually, because I'm not paying too much attention to you other than to make sure that you're not going to do harm to me, right? Which we're still wrestling with in 2021, So, I mean, the challenge is so W.B. Du Bois was free, but, you got people like Frederick Douglass, who was born into slavery. And the things that Frederick Douglass wrote about in his biographies are the same things that I'm worried about today.
Yeah, the human species has not made much progress in thousands of years. And I agree. When I listened to it, I thought they were fascinating to read and listen to. I do both. But it really there's so much there that's still so very much here.
Yeah.
So let's move on, because another term that we hear a lot now is systemic racism. And so I looked at Cambridge's definition, because I couldn't find Merriam-Webster's. That's my go-to, but they don't have compound words. So, and so they define systemic racism as policies and practices that exist throughout a whole society or organization, and that result in and support a continued unfair advantage to some people and unfair or harmful treatment of others based on race. Is that a fair definition?
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah.
Okay. And is that different than structural racism, or are they just two different names for the same thing?
Well, I think the concept is the same. Whether you call it systemic racism, structural racism, in the 1960s, it was called institutional racism. The point is that there are practices, protocols, and procedures that are at play to keep some people out of being at the table for decision making, at the table for thriving, and at the table for flourishing. And those systems, practices, and protocols, procedures are in essence protected by the gatekeepers. And in many ways in the 21st century, I would argue that many of those gatekeepers are good people. They're good, God-fearing people who, if you accuse them of being racist, they would probably balk and faint, right? The problem is that the systems and the procedures and the protocols that they're protecting are where the structuralized inconsistencies and double standards are, right? So it's in the protocol. So when you think about, there's this interview with Meghan Markle, and the prince or the former prince and Oprah Winfrey, and the notion that their baby Archie would not get a title because he's a biracial child. That's a systemic procedure, protocol, right? And the fact that because of that he would not get protection. That's a strategic, that's a protocol procedure that in many ways is racist, because why he doesn't get it? Because of what we call here in the United States the one drop rule. He has one drop of black blood, and he's not, of pure, British, bloodline.
But I think some people would say, so tell me how you would respond to this. And I'll confess, I am not the person who follows Meghan Markle and Prince Harry and could care less about all of the pop. I'm not a good pop culture guy about what's going on, but would say, well, we don't know that's the reason he's not made a prince. There's all kinds of rules about this kind of stuff and tradition. Do we know that's the reason? Because the royal family, of course, wouldn't say that and hasn't.
Well, I mean, let's look at the history of it, and then we'll come back and say that if we do know the reason, because it is actually an edict within the monarchy. But it's the same monarchy that practiced in slavery. It's the same monarchy that was part of colonialism. It's not a different monarchy, right? It's the same monarchy.
But it sounds like you're saying the reason that, and so I would think to look at other exact same examples of him to see, are there other cases where the younger son's children are also made princes, right? That would be, and I just don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, everybody,
like they're guilty of those things, so they must be guilty of this.
Everybody in the royal family has a title. Like, that's right. And I'm not a huge royal follower either, but again, we learned this in middle school, world history, that everybody in the royal family has a title. And in many ways, they're protected by the wall of the royalty, right? Yeah. So for this biracial child, right? And again, Charles, has never happened in history of the crown, which is why the whole marriage, to Meghan Markle was a big thing, right? Because the royal family, again, participated in the colonization of, the global South. Same monarchy, not a different monarchy, right? So in the traditional rules of the royal household, this has been etched in stone.
So well, let's move away from that because I can't tell. I don't know what I don't know enough about it to be smart. And so, but I stumble on this term just based on the concept that words have meanings. And I know as a preacher, right, that's your craft. As a professor, that's your craft.
Yeah.
But I'm also wired up that way. So the problem of just the terminology I get hung up on, that is, if racism is a belief, how does a system have a belief?
Because the system is protected by people.
Okay.
Right. So systems in their own don't exist. Right. It's the people who not only create the systems, but maintain the systems, modify the systems, and protect the systems. So if the system takes on the beliefs of the people who are in charge of it, which is why leadership is so important. And if you have leaders who are unwilling and uncourageous to change the bones of a system, then no matter how much surface work you do, you can paint the house X amount of times, but every other winter, you're going to have to put a new coat on it, right? But you don't have to put a new coat on the bones of the house because the bones of the house are solid. So the procedures and protocols and policies are the bones of a system, right? And so when we do a lot of work to try to create diversity, equity, and inclusivity, we often paint, we often, revinyl, we often swap out a window, but we usually don't go into the system and change a femur bone, or we usually don't change a hip bone or do a shoulder replacement. And I think that's the tension.
You're more generous than I am, because I think half the time when we talk about diversity and inclusivity, what we're really doing is we just smash a window or two and walk away.
Yeah.
And so help me out then. When we talk about a system being racist, what system do we mean? Is it the free market system? Is it the education system? Is it the American system? I don't even know what the American system is, but what do we mean by a system when we use it that way?
So if you take an institution, and let's just take an institution of higher learning. So, and let me actually get away from that. Let me take
that's dangerous for you to talk about.
Did you see the wheels turning, Charles? Let's take most private Christian schools, and let's take middle and high school. Most of them were created during two interesting seasons within American history. This is localized in the United States. One, at the end of the Civil War. Two, during the Civil Rights Movement. So if you go to some of our historic Christian private schools, wonderful people, you'll find that those schools were responding to the fact that during the Civil War, these Black folks were going to be free, and thus they would be educated alongside of our children. We don't want that. So we want to have the right to educate them however we want to. Let's build a Christian school, because under the notion of Christianity, we can actually declare the rules with our rights and our, religious freedom, whatnot. Same thing happens during the Civil Rights Movement. You got Brown v's Board of Education, integration or desegregation, however you want to terminate that, of schools. And so in many ways, the structures of these schools were created for us's and not them's. Now, over time, these schools are trying to diversify, but it's going to be hard to diversify because they're the pockets of money that actually called the schools into existence were firmly rooted in protecting the us's versus the them's.
Well, let me push back on half of that. Because my understanding is, and if we're talking about the southern states in particular, in the southern states at the time of the Civil War, most didn't have public education at all. So schools that are starting aren't starting necessarily to say, hey, I don't want black kids educated with my white kids. It was, there were no schools. And public education became an outgrowth of Reconstruction in many cases. Am I wrong about that?
You're not wrong, but I'm talking about the North, not the South.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm talking about your Chicago's and
So,
your Massachusetts.
Those coming out of civil rights more than the post-slavery movement.
Well, yeah, I mean, you have some of those in Massachusetts. Take some of the most prestigious schools that have been around for forever. I mean, look at their founding dates, and I mean that's a great experiment and exercise for many of us. Yeah. To see that this is not conjecture, it's not hyperbole. This is actually real. We just choose not to look at that.
Well, and if I remember it right, Du Bois, refresh my memory on this, but Du Bois went to a school in New Hampshire or had a school in New Hampshire. I can't remember. And they tore, and it was either a mixed race school or it was an African-American school. And the townspeople tore it down. Am I remembering that right? Or he tells that story. It wasn't him. He tells that story.
Yeah, he tells a story. He's out of Greater Barrington, Massachusetts, which is out, in the western part of Massachusetts. But yeah, I mean, he tells a number of stories similar to that there was a clear delineation between who these schools were for and who they're not for. And in that, you see the systemic racism.
Yeah. That's the only point. An issue that I don't want my kids educated with black kids. It was, I don't want a school for black kids in my town.
I mean, you can parse it however you want to, though.
I'm not justifying it for that. Yeah, I'm just saying it's not even as much as putting them together. It was, I don't want it. I don't want a period.
Yeah. I don't want black people around my children, essentially. Right. And so in raising our children with that type of sensibility, what does that say to your children when they grow up to be adults? Well, these are the people who my parents were protecting me from. There must be something bad about them, even though I've never experienced it, but my parents would not lie to me. So I'm just going to believe that something's bad about these people.
Now, the example you used and the words you used sounded to me like you were saying there are people today who run that system, mm-hmm. and they're looking to preserve their control of that system. Mm-hmm. And so give me an example of that, because I think most systems just kind of run.
No. In private institutions, man, the donors are the most important.
Okay,
people, man.
So you would argue. So is your argument then? And I don't want to put words in your mouth, so feel free to say no. It's not my argument. Is your argument then, when we're talking about private Christian schools, that donors are saying, I don't want black kids in that school with my kids today, versus a legacy of geography where we're segregated, versus a legacy of what might have started the school? Are you saying there are people controlling that today that way?
Well, first of all, my dear brother, I'm not arguing with you.
Well, sorry, I'm using it in the academic term.
I may be postulating, but I'm not arguing with you. So
hoping to work our way up to an argument, but we're not there yet.
I think there's a number of different ways, and let me say it this way, because maybe this will make more sense. There are a number of different ways that old money continues to manifest old ideas.
Okay.
But we often don't cut off the old money. You see what I mean? And those old monies reinforce old ideas, because those old monies operated a line item specificity that kind of sometimes prevent certain things from happening that would be counter to that old money, right? So the ideas behind why the donor invested in the organization may be an old idea that the organization itself no longer believes. But because the organization, does not want to get rid of that old money, it has to figure out how to wiggle and dance around, how do I keep this, but how do I move in this direction? So, and I think that's a tension.
There are clearly Christian schools formed not out of the civil rights era and formed later, mm-hmm. Who still will be overwhelmingly one race or the other. Mm-hmm. That's a geographic issue, I would think, more than anything else, and maybe an affordability issue.
Well, so if it's a geographic issue and if it's an affordability issue, then we have to walk into things like redlining, right? Why is it that Black folks are not able to roam around the nation freely and buy homes in certain neighborhoods so that these places can be desegregated. Why is it that certain schools are put in locations where they're not going to benefit a population of students that may, we got to think about the contextual piece around that. So I would agree with you that certain schools are in homogenous, monolithic neighborhoods that don't have, ethnic diversity. And so the next question is, why does this community not have ethnic diversity? And if it's because we make the assumption that ethnic people can't afford to live in the neighborhood, that's a horrible assumption, because we got Black millionaires and Black billionaires all over the country. So what's the next reason why they're not there? And then we usually dig down and we go back to the 50s and 60s and look at redlining and the inability for Black folks to get mortgages in certain neighborhoods and whatnot. So, it always goes down a rabbit hole, which creates exhaustion, and which was why most people don't want to talk about it.
And redlining, for sure, I agree with you, plays a role in this, right? Because the legacy of that is still with us today. Mm-hmm. And you can't get away with that. The Thurnstroms, and you may remember the name of the book better than I do. I can't think of it. They wrote a book in the 90s, and one of them was an advisor to President Clinton when he started his dialogue on race thing. And they make the point in their book that actually part of the problem, if we want to call it a problem, is that African Americans, at least in the 90s, mm-hmm. wanted, I'm trying to remember it exactly, were comfortable living in mixed race neighborhoods as long as, but preferred not to be more than 50% white. Mm. And so there's some level of preference there, because then now if you just do the math, right, if African Americans are 13% of the population, you want to live in a neighborhood, there's going to be populations like where we are in New Hampshire, where there's just not, it's, mm-hmm. redlining could have never happened, and there's still not enough to make the math work, right? Mm-hmm. And so it seems to me that the segregation is a factor of a legacy of redlining, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but I want to test it with you. A legacy of redlining, personal preferences of both African Americans and whites about what they feel comfortable with in their neighborhoods, mm-hmm. And some level of affordability, because there are African American billionaires and millionaires, there's also on average a higher level of wealth that white Americans have versus Black Americans, for again a lot of historical reasons and other reasons. And so can we say though that the only reason we're segregated is because of racism though? Because I would argue there's a whole bunch of things, and I'm not arguing either, but I'm arguing it.
Well, I think it plays out in a number of ways. Black folks, so whereas there may not be a huge population of African American domestic Black folks in New Hampshire, there are a huge population of other ethnic Black folks in New Hampshire. You dig what I mean? So people from Caribbean or whatnot, different islands have enclaves. New Hampshire has a huge population of refugees, from different places. So again, the way that we see New Hampshire in terms of domestic African Americans, one would think about, are there job opportunities for me to grow, to thrive and flourish? How's the healthcare system up there for me? Are there Black doctors who can contextualize my own health crises in such that I would get, fair and equitable treatment? Take it at the granular level. Where are the Black barbershops, right? Are there Black private schools for my children? And if those things don't already exist there, then that doesn't become a landmark for the mass exodus of people. However, New Hampshire was on the Underground Railroad, trail. So there have been Black people who come through New Hampshire. I don't know what their experiences have been, but for whatever reason, they didn't stay. Again, I don't have a reflection on what that means, but.
Yeah, and I think a whole bunch of things. I think about so my background is Irish, German, Polish, all coming in, and my grandparents' generation or one more than that. And they all moved into an enclave, mm-hmm. right, because there was support, network, stuff like that. And eventually, right, move out of that enclave, but then still don't move far, at least in our family. And I know people have moved all over the world. I got a lot of friends moved different parts of the country, but our family was, until 2 years ago, we all live within 20 minutes of each other. And so there is this family connection of, there might even be good jobs in New Hampshire. There might even be good networks, but my family and my right is here. And so we are, I heard somebody preaching on, we are people of place. In addition to other things. So there's other things that hold me back from having that perfectly desegregated society that I would say is not a racist thing. It's just people being people and wanting to be connected to the people they care about and love and care for. And I have a job and I like it. So there's some other stuff that seems to play into it that I wouldn't say is systemic racism. Am I being fair in that? I
think you have every right to reflect however you want to reflect. I'm not going to challenge your reflection, my brother.
and so could you give me another example? So when we talk about systemic racism, what's something else from outside the academic world or the school world?
Healthcare.
So say more if you would, please.
So when we think about the rollout of the vaccine, at least the past months, I know that many legislation has been changed even as of yesterday.
State by state.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So the statement was made that the people who needed the vaccine the worst, most urgent, would be the first to get it. And when those attempts were made, they still were not the first to get it. And so that means that somewhere in the procedures and the protocols and how the rollout happened in various places, right, that there was still an opportunity for a power dynamic to play. So one of the rollout places was at the Reggie Lewis Center in the middle of the Black neighborhood in Boston, right? Not too many white people live over there. On the opening day of the rollout for the vaccine, Charles, outside the Reggie Lewis Center in all lines was all white people. No Black people there. How does that happen? How does that happen?
And so let me comment that because that's a great example. I talked to another pastor. He's raised this point a couple of times where he's African American. His church is mostly African American, and the nearest distribution site is at some big mall in the neighboring town. And his point is, my folks don't have cars and stuff like that, right? They're urban dwellers. They don't have cars to get out there, and that's racist. Is the way I think he's talking about it. It's certainly not fair, I would say, and it's not right. And so if we believe that the right way to do the distribution is the most at-risk people, that's elderly and it's African American and it's urban, I think, based on my reading, because in urban centers we have we're closer together, which increases the risk. I'm not in an urban area, but still. If you are African American for whatever reasons of closeness, comorbidity rates, there's also a higher infection and death rate, and then the elder. So though it would seem that would be our targeted areas. And so is your supposition, and I know you're not saying what he's saying, right? It's your supposition, not your argument. It's your supposition. Do you think somebody actively decides, okay, well, we're going to put it in this other community because there's white people there, and I don't care about the Black people in this community? Or do you think something else is at play?
I think something else is at play. I think there's an articulation to appease the emotional sensibilities of people so that people feel that we do the right thing and inherently build trust. The reality is, if you wanted those Black, urban, inner city people of whatever age group, if you wanted them to have the vaccine first, you know where they are. Take it to them.
Right.
Don't create a system based on a privileged sensibility that if they really want it, they'll come and get it. Right. And that's where the superiority place comes in, because if you create a system and it's articulated as meant for them and they don't show up, then we get to the same rubric that there are no qualified Black folks, right? We see this in our job searches. We see this in other opportunities. It's not that they don't exist. It's oftentimes that they were not thought about when you created an opportunity for them. And so if you want Black, urban elders to be the first to get the vaccines, you know where they are, take it to them.
So let me take those two different examples separately, because I think there might be some different things to talk about in each one. In the one where the pastor is saying they didn't put it in my community, I think there's a world's perspective on that, and there's a church perspective on that. So let me try this with you. The world's perspective is, hey, look, that's the easiest place. It's a big mall, lots of parking, easy in, easy out, all those kinds of things, can accommodate huge crowds. That logically makes sense to do it there. Race plays no role in it. From the church's perspective, though, I think when we hear God's emphasis on his care for the poor, the disadvantaged in society, those without power in society, as the church, we should look at that and say, it doesn't matter whether that's the easiest way to do it. Figure out a way to get to this population because they're more at risk and they're more in need. Am I unreasonable in thinking the world is going to think differently about this than the church?
No, I mean, I think both scenarios that you raise are potential scenarios. I think the other scenario is that, you put it at a public mall. I'm not even going to a public mall, Charles, because I don't want to get the illness. I mean, if you're indoors, no one knows about
they did it. I think they may have been doing it outside even. I don't know, because it was a parking lot they wanted.
Until this week, man, it's been 30 degrees outside again, right? I mean, my point is that we can rationalize it on paper, and on paper it looks great. But if you want these folks to be the first to get it, go take it to them. Now, when you get to the church piece, I mean, this is my challenge to the church. If a population of people say that you're operating from a sense of unfairness, why are we arguing? Like, the very nature of the Acts, the church in the book of Acts was the 7 deacons, the diakonos. They were called into ministry because the people were not getting served, right? The widows and the orphans were not getting served. So it was no debate over, well, you guys should have showed up here and we had it available for you at this time. No, a ministry was created. An ordained ministry was created because these people were not being served. And then, the second chapter of Acts, it also talks about that people sold their possessions in order to provide for those who didn't have. So again, the notion of equity and inclusivity is not a worldly concept, it's a biblical concept. And what we don't see in the Bible is this sense of superiority. So anytime you have a people subjugating another people to the whims of how they decide that they should act, operate, and abide, we got a power dynamic that is not of God. And so in that church situation, we got to reconcile that.
If we're going to go to that scenario, though, I would say the government didn't do that, because I think the government's incapable of doing a lot of things that we need done in our society. The government didn't do that. The church did that, and there was an agreement that someone was being treated unfairly, and that was wrong. I think part of our problem in the conversations I have and the things I see and read is we don't agree there's a problem in some cases. We don't agree that that what you're telling me is unfair is unfair. And then in fairness, if I want to be generous to folks and honest, I don't even know what to do about it anyway, right? I don't know how to solve it. And so help me with those kinds of thoughts.
Yeah, but I mean, if I'm saying that I'm hurt, why do you get to disagree? I mean, that's like I mean, if I'm saying, I mean, let's bring it to, to current day situation. If I'm saying you have your knee on my neck, why do you waste 9 minutes trying to convince me that it doesn't hurt me? Like, why wouldn't you just get your knee off my neck and then we can talk, right? And so the notion that there is room for a debate and that there's room for disagreement when we're talking about the urgency of survival is where supremacy operates, because now you become my Lord in deciding whether my grievance is valid or not. And that's not an equal playing field.
Well, I agree that's not equal, but let me challenge you on it a little bit, because I think if part of it is, and I'm not saying you're not suffering or anything like that, so this is all hypothetical for me, right? And so I don't know you, and so I don't hear you telling me that to begin with. to the extent I do hear someone telling me that, I don't know them either. Right. So there's no relationship, there's no firsthand connection. And some of those people saying that have a very clear political agenda. And so I'm happy to help you, but to help you, I'm going to have to disadvantage myself, which I think we're called to do as Christians. If somebody needs help, we're supposed to disadvantage ourselves. But somebody's going to have to convince me that I should disadvantage myself because there's an actual problem.
I think what you just articulated is the challenge within human history, that for an ostracized people, it's on them to convince the non-ostracized people that there's a situation, that it's real, that it's not a political agenda, and that they can be of help to it if they have the courage to help. And then you got to go to part B. Now we got to convince them to have the courage to help. And then we as the oppressed people got to tell them how to help us, when to help us, why to help us. So all the work is over here for the oppressed people. And you see that in the history of humanity. It's the same thing with sexual assault. It's the same thing with domestic violence. We can move it away from racial stuff, right? If somebody says that they have been assaulted, the onus is on them to prove that the assault happened, which means that they have to re-traumatize themselves, re-trigger themselves just to stand before a judge who's actually not an official judge in order to get to the official judge, but the pre-official judge gets to decide whether it's valid or not. And so the onus is why? Why do I need to go through all of that, right? And who made you, right? The judge, the jury, and whatnot. And so that's the superiority piece in here. And that's how the racism tends to play out when the Black community, by the data, not even correlated by Black folks, but by the academics and the scientists, are showing that Black people and brown people are dying disproportionately to other folks. And the other folks get the right to suggest that I don't want to wear a mask. I mean, like,
yeah. And so we get into a lot of issues around the criminal justice system and equality and all that. What I'm trying to get to then is because I think we said early on that if I try to help you without you having a voice, right, I do something to you. So the how to help me, I think, has to come from you.
No, it comes from our relationship.
Okay.
It comes from our relationship. When you're not afraid of me, then you'll believe anything that I say because you know my heart.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? And so because you know my heart, now you actually care about me. You'll actually intervene on something that you see coming that I don't even see. So I don't even have the opportunity, Charles, to ask for your help because you see something that's going to negatively impact me and you care about me so much that you actually will prevent that from happening to me without me even knowing it. Now, when you fear me, now you have to worry about with everything that I say. Is he trying to dupe me? Is he trying to, run his own agenda? Is he trying to take advantage of our relationship? Is he trying to use me for something? Right? That's when you don't know me and you don't know my heart. So the challenge is, how do we get to the place of not being afraid of each other, such that when I yell, you come running just to see if I'm okay, versus you run away because whatever got me, you don't want it to get you.
And so help me theologically too, because you're speaking from a place of theology already, I think, but if you can be a little more specific, I think it would be helpful. Yeah. And so the point we're making is, look, I don't, right? You're saying, hey, as the Black person, I have to convince you, white person, I have a problem. And we're oversimplifying, I understand, but white person, help. I need to convince you I have a problem. As this is another place where I think of, I get why that should be that way in the world. But in the church, it ought not to be that way, because theologically, I think I have an obligation to disadvantage myself to even find out if there is really a problem. which means now I have to be the one who reaches out to you, and I need to be the one who's trying to understand it. So to forget about disadvantaging yourself to solve it.
Mm.
You need to disadvantage yourself to help me get there theologically, though. Tell me.
Right. So the whole notion of disadvantaging oneself operates on a sense of currency, right? There's some, and I'm not talking just money, but there's some loss that has to be, done in order to benefit the other. I think what Jesus was saying is the exact opposite of that. The gain is in us being one together. Right. So it's never a loss to be in fellowship with a brother or sister, and it's a gain. So I actually gain something, Charles, by caring about you so much that I desire for you to thrive and for you to flourish. I gain something. It's not a loss. So that when you go through a dark and deep place, and I show up to be a partner with you, and I show up to be a journeyman with you, and I show up to be a prayer warrior for you, I'm not thinking about what I'm losing in my time and my energy and what else I could have been doing. I'm thinking about the gratitude that I have, because in my mind, I should do unto others as I would have them do unto me. I'm thinking about the fact that Jesus gave his life so that the wages of my sin would not cause me everlasting death. So who am I to even think about how much I got to give up in order to be your brother? Right? I think it's a blessing and a privilege to be in fellowship and to be siblings by the invitation and grace of Christ.
And so I think that's a great point. And so I don't know the right way to say it, I don't mean to minimize it, but in the fullness of time and the grand scheme of things, right, it is blessing if we can get to unity, and it is blessing when we are loving each other the way Jesus talked about. But I think, at least in this case, it starts with somebody has to disadvantage themselves. Because, for example, the conversation that almost every conversation we have with race in this country starts with, white people typically go self-educate. Well, to go take time to self-educate is taking time. I'm going to disadvantage myself to get into the conversation. Now, at the end of the day, I agree with you. I'm blessed. But doesn't it have to start with somebody disadvantaging themselves?
Well, I mean, so me personally, I think self-education is one model. I don't think it works that well for me, right? Because when you educate yourself, you re-indoctrinate your core beliefs, and your core belief, it's kind of hard for that to happen, for it to change, clearly without the presence of the Holy Spirit. When we're in conversation like this, Charles, both of us learn. Right. And we're invested in each other's learning, and we're invested in each other's growth. So for you to do that on your own self is kind of a white evangelical individualistic thing. Not all of us operate like that. Many of us people of color are what we call either collectivist, culture, or communal culture, where we tend to learn together. Right. The way that you learn how to cook is by being in the kitchen with your grandmama and your mama and your daddy and all them, and you're participating, right? So you start out on the dishwashing line, right? Your responsibility is wash the dishes. Then all of a sudden you get to cut the vegetables. You're the sous chef, and then they'll let you come in, right? So it's a practice-oriented learning, right? But the whole bookworm thing, I'm not sure if that's the most effective way when we're talking about relational challenges, right? You fix relational challenges by being relational, not by reading.
Well, let's say reading is effective, because I'm on like my 35th book here. and what I've tried to do is be all across the spectrum. And so, but I'm this analytical guy, right? So that the data, that's where it's been really helpful to me.
Yeah.
But I think your point is, at least even if you start there, that can't be the wholeness of it.
Yeah, because you got to work that stuff out in real time, man. I mean, you when you read 35 books, Charles, you become very good at reading, which is great and it's honorable, right? But when you have all that book knowledge and all that heady knowledge, until it gets down to your heart level, right? And until it gets down to your hand and feet level, right? I'm not sure how beneficial it is. And if those 35 books can change your mind about things that you previously were held fast to, then perhaps you can convince me that reading 35 books is the way to go about it. But I know that talking to someone where it doesn't have to be disagreeable, even if we disagree, and you can see the fruit that is born by that, then I think that helps. And yes, 35 books helps to inform you so that you can be conversational, and a good conversationalist. So let me not poo-poo on the 35 books, but the relational thing, you don't fix relational challenges without being relational.
It's very similar to the, I know everything about the Bible, I can recite every verse, but if it doesn't turn into obvious love that people can see and action, then, James would say it's dead.
It's dead.
Right. And Paul would say the same thing. He just uses different words.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So I knew we would not get to even like half our agenda. But so we're at an hour. So let's stop. I hope you'll come back.
Hey, anytime you call me, man. This has been a blessed time. Charles, thank you for just being a phenomenal conversationalist. As you mentioned on the front side, no one was trying to convince anybody of anything other than that we can actually have these difficult conversations without being difficult, and we can still love each other along the way. And by having these conversations, I get to know you better. You get to know me better. I'm not afraid of you. I know that you're not afraid of me, and we can kind of work through some stuff together. So thank you for this platform.
Well, thank you for saying that. I'm going to tell it to my kids too, because whenever they're sitting on their devices, I tell them, talk to me. I'm an effervescent conversationalist. But it's, to me, this has been a fascinating conversation, and it's so helpful, wired up the way I am, at least. I don't know if it's helpful to you, but it's helpful to me to kind of probe and dig. And that's where I think for me, I hear your point on reading. For me, on the books, it's been helpful because it gives me the context to know where to probe and and it has shifted my thinking on things. And so have conversations like this, and so has the friendship that we have growing between us. It's really it's been so helpful. I appreciate it. And so thanks for thank you for your work on public radio. Thank you for your work on your podcast. Thank you for your work in a church. Thank you for your work at Gordon. Thank you for your work in the Big C Church.
Amen.
And I think I'm blessed by you, and we're blessed by you. And so thanks for being with us today too, and having what aren't easy conversations, but I've loved it and I've appreciated it. So thank you, Emmett.
Amen.
We're called to be peacemakers, and I forget who said it, but we're not called to be peacekeepers. And sometimes we get the two confused. And if we want to make peace, we need to figure this issue out around race. And that's why the guy who said, hey, stop talking about it, I think that's wrong. I don't think you make peace by ignoring it. And I think we need to be peacemakers. Which means we need to understand the dialogue, understand the words, understand and take the time to do that and figure it out and think about what it would look like evangelistically if the church had no racial issues in it and there was no racial divide and we loved each other. Think of the witness that would be to the world and how evangelistic that would be to be able to say the church has figured this out. There must be something about those Christians, and I find it attractive. I think there's huge potential there. But it's going to be hard work. And so I appreciate you taking time to have, I'm sure, conversations you have with a lot of people all the time. And so thank you for being patient and having one more time with me. And I'd like to thank our audience for being with us. Our prayer is that God uses this conversation to advance our collective thinking, right, on how we deal with these issues in our culture that drives us to unity, justice, personally and societally, and to accelerate evangelism. And I'd like to thank our producer, Bob Atherton. Next week, we actually have, coincidentally, a colleague of yours with us, Emmett. Dr. J. Anthony Lloyd will be our guest.
Yeah, my pastor.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, man.
I didn't know that. So he's the pastor at Greater Framingham Community Church, but he's also a professor at Gordon Conwell. And so we'll be talking to him about evangelism, sharing Jesus, and what God is doing in Framingham. And so look forward to seeing you then. And Emmett, thanks again for being with us.
God bless you, Charles. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining the podcast today. If you'd like to learn more about Vision New England and what God is doing in our region, check out our website at visionnewengland.org. We hope you'll join us next time for the Church in Action podcast.